They refused the old rancher a drink, and before the next sunrise, the town itself would belong to the man they laughed at. Dust rolled low across Red Hollow like old ghosts drifting between hitching posts, and the evening sun burned copper through the batwing doors of the Broken Spur Saloon. Inside, boots scraped rough pine floorboards, cards slapped tabletops, whiskey glasses clinked, and every man in the room turned when the old rancher stepped in. Elias Boone moved slow, not weak but measured, like a man who had learned long ago that silence carried farther than shouting. His coat was faded to the color of dry earth, his hat brim worn soft by years of sun, and his boots held the red dust of 50 hard miles. He walked to the bar and set down a silver coin so old its edges looked bitten by history. "Just a drink," he said. His voice was low as winter wind. The barkeep, Vernon Pike, looked him over and smirked. "That coin won't buy spit in this town." Laughter stirred in the room. Someone muttered, "Drifters drink at the trough." Another voice called, "Looks like the grave sent one back thirsty." Elias did not answer. He only rested one weathered hand on the bar as Pike pushed the coin back across the wood. It spun, glinted in lamplight, and rolled to the floor. No one moved to pick it up. The old rancher bent, lifted it from the dust, and for a moment studied the face stamped into the silver as though reading something the others could not see. At a corner table, an Apache elder wrapped in a dark wool blanket watched without blinking. Dakota. Some in town claimed he appeared only when reckonings rode near. Elias slipped the coin into his pocket. "No drink, then," he said. Pike leaned over the bar. "Not for broke ghosts." More laughter. One cowboy tipped his glass in mock salute. But Elias only turned and let his eyes drift slowly over the room, over the men, over the oil lamps, over the cracked mirror behind the bottles, over the deed notice pinned near the register. He seemed to memorize every inch. Then he stepped back into the dusk. Outside, wind hissed through the hitch rails. A stray dog crossed the street. The old rancher stood looking at the town's wooden sign, Red Hollow, as though weighing it in his thoughts. Dakota emerged beside him without sound. "You let them shame you," the elder said. Elias gave a small smile. "A man learns more when others think he has nothing." Dakota's eyes narrowed toward the horizon where darkness gathered. "And what rides tonight?" Elias looked west where the last sunlight bled behind the mesas. "Judgment," he said softly, though it sounded almost like mercy. Then he mounted his old bay horse and rode into the desert while lanterns flickered behind him. Men inside the saloon laughed a while longer, believing the joke was over. None noticed the silver coin had left a ring in the dust where it had fallen. None guessed that before dawn Elias Boone would ride 70 miles through Black Prairie to a bank that had waited 20 years for his return. And none in Red Hollow yet understood they had not turned away a poor old rancher. They had insulted the one man who already owned the ground beneath their boots. The desert held its breath as Elias Boone rode west beneath a moon thin as a silver blade. His bay horse moved steady through sage and sand, hooves whispering over hardpan, while the night wind carried the dry smell of mesquite and old rain. He rode without lantern, guided by memory older than the railroad, older than Red Hollow itself. 50 miles out, where the prairie opened wide as an ocean and the stars seemed nailed into black iron, he reached a weathered stage depot long abandoned by most men but not by those who remembered promises. A single lamp still burned in the window. Elias tied his horse and stepped inside where an old telegraph key sat silent beside ledgers thick with dust. Behind the desk, a white-haired station keeper looked up, froze, and slowly stood. "Good Lord," he whispered. "Boone." Elias removed his gloves finger by finger. "Still keeping the wire alive, Amos?" The old man nodded. "For some messages, yes." Elias laid the silver coin on the desk. Amos stared at it as if seeing a ghost. "You kept it." Elias said nothing for a moment. The room creaked in the night wind. Then he spoke. "Send to Carson City Bank. Wake the directors. Tell them the original deed holder has come home." While Amos tapped the wire, sparks flickering like trapped fireflies, Elias opened a leather satchel he had carried beneath his coat. Out came folded maps, yellowed land grants, railroad bonds sealed in blue wax, papers no one in Red Hollow had imagined existed. Hours passed under the ticking wall clock. Coffee simmered black on an iron stove. At last distant hoofbeats sounded. 2 riders arrived before dawn, both in city coats dusty from the trail. One carried a lockbox chained shut. The taller man removed his hat. "Mr. Boone," he said, "we thought you were dead." Elias almost smiled. That made business easier. They spread documents across the desk. Every parcel under Red Hollow traced back to one forgotten agreement signed 40 years before, when a young rancher had financed a rail spur nobody believed would survive. Interest had compounded like hidden thunder. Tax liens had defaulted. Mortgages had folded into one controlling share. The town, without knowing it, had been slowly drifting back toward one name: Boone. Amos looked between the papers and Elias with quiet awe. "All these years they called you a poor old cattleman." Elias fastened the satchel shut. A man can hear truth better when people think he is small. Outside, dawn began silver at the horizon. But before mounting up, Elias stepped behind the depot where Dakota waited beside a cottonwood as if he had grown from the earth itself. The Apache elder held the old rancher's silver coin in his palm, though Elias had not seen him take it. "The circle closes," Dakota said. Elias looked toward the east where Red Hollow still slept. "Not yet." Dakota pressed the coin back into his hand. "Will you take revenge?" Elias considered the word. Then he shook his head. "No. I will buy dignity where they sold humiliation." They rode east together as morning spread over the prairie. And in Red Hollow, while men still snored above the saloon and Vernon Pike counted yesterday's receipts, a stagecoach already rolled toward town carrying 3 lawyers, a federal recorder, and a deed book heavy enough to change every name on Main Street. Morning broke over Red Hollow with the pale gold. Light that makes rough towns look honest for a few minutes before truth returns. Smoke curled from stovepipes, mules stamped beside wagons, and Vernon Pike swept yesterday's dust from his saloon porch without knowing the ground itself was slipping from under him. By 7 o'clock the stage rolled in, iron-rimmed wheels grinding against Main Street, not carrying gamblers or drifters but men in black coats with polished boots too clean for frontier dust. People drifted from storefronts to watch. Curiosity moved faster than wind in small towns. The federal recorder climbed down first, carrying a leather case clasped in brass. Then the lawyers. Then Elias Boone, riding in behind them beside Dakota, silent as weather. Conversations thinned. Even the blacksmith paused mid-hammer. Vernon squinted from the saloon porch. "Well now," he called, forcing a laugh. "The ghost brought company." Elias dismounted slowly and said nothing. That unsettled them more than anger would have. The tallest lawyer unrolled papers on a dry goods barrel and read in a voice clear enough to carry to the far hitch rail. By authority of Territorial Land Statute and the Carson City Banking Trust, all properties in Red Hollow held under delinquent lease and secondary lien were transferred at dawn to sole controlling claimant Elias Boone. Silence followed so sudden a horse snorted loud as thunder. No one moved. Then came murmurs, disbelief first, then fear wearing the shape of jokes. "This some trick?" a ranch hand asked. The recorder held up embossed seals. "It is law." Vernon stepped down from the porch, face losing color. "My saloon." The lawyer glanced at the deed book. "Owned by Mr. Boone as of sunrise." Across the street, the hotel keeper removed his hat. The livery owner whispered a prayer. But Elias only walked into the saloon where 12 hours before they had denied him a drink. Boots tapped the pine floor as every eye followed him. He reached the bar and placed the same silver coin upon the wood. It rang softly. "Yesterday," he said. "This bought me nothing." Vernon swallowed hard. "Mr. Boone, if there was offense?" Elias lifted one hand and the man fell silent. "Pour a glass." Vernon obeyed with trembling fingers, filling a tumbler with whiskey amber in the sun. Elias did not drink. He pushed the glass toward the Apache elder beside him. Dakota accepted it with calm dignity, and in that simple motion half the room understood something larger than ownership had entered. Then Elias turned toward the window, looking out at townsfolk gathering in the dust. "This place was built on men being turned away," he said. "Today that ends." He ordered free water and coffee set out for travelers, widows, ranch hands, and any stranger passing through. Murmurs shifted again, confusion now edged with shame. Vernon looked as though expecting ruin. Instead, Elias said, "You may keep running the saloon." The barkeep blinked. "Why?" Elias answered without looking back. "Because a lesson kept is worth more than a punishment delivered." Yet even then the deeper twist had not arrived. For while the town struggled to grasp that the old rancher owned every board and brick around them, a freight wagon approached from the eastern road carrying survey stakes, seed sacks, and a second sealed ledger none had yet opened, one that would reveal Elias Boone had not come merely to own Red Hollow, but to give most of it away. The second ledger was bound in cracked blue leather and smelled faintly of cedar when the federal recorder opened it on the saloon bar. Men leaned closer. Women stood outside the batwing doors listening in stillness. Even the flies seemed to vanish from the room. Elias Boone rested one hand on the ledger but let the recorder read. Parcel by parcel, acre by acre, the town heard a thing stranger than loss. The eastern grazing fields, 60 acres, transferred to 3 widows whose husbands had died owing feed debt. The South Creek water rights, once fenced off by merchants, restored for public use. 10 homestead plots reserved for families pushed off the land during the rail years. Each sentence fell like a slow hammer, not of destruction but correction. Faces that had braced for revenge now wore confusion. Vernon Pike whispered, "You are giving it away." Elias answered, "No, returning it." But then came the line that changed the air entirely. By covenant preserved in the original Boone Treaty Survey, 140 acres west of Cottonwood Ridge were restored to the Apache settlement under guardianship of Elder Takota. A hush deeper than surprise settled over Red Hollow. Some men stared at Takota as if seeing him for the first time. The old Apache stepped forward, his weathered fingers touching the paper with reverence. "This was promised before many here were born," he said. "And promises do not die when men forget them." A ranch hand near the stove muttered that none of this made sense. Elias turned and looked at him, not stern, almost weary. "What does not make sense is a town believing insult has no cost." Then he reached into his coat and drew out the silver coin again. Sun from the window caught its worn face. "This was payment made to me by an Apache healer when I was 19 and dying of fever near the river." He looked toward Takota. "Her grandson stands beside me now." Murmurs rippled. Vernon Pike slowly removed his hat. The barkeep who had mocked him the night before now seemed smaller than his own shadow. Outside, the freight wagon was unloaded. Seed sacks stacked beside survey stakes. Children gathered around as though a fair had come to town. But Elias had one more thing to do. He walked to the saloon doorway and pinned a handwritten notice beside the entrance where yesterday men had laughed. "Water free to any traveler." No man turned away. Some read it twice as if unable to trust the words. Then an old widow stepped forward and touched Elias's sleeve. "Why show mercy to folks who showed none?" she asked. Elias watched dust move down Main Street. "Because humiliation taught me what hunger feels like." Yet beneath the grace another current moved. The federal recorder quietly handed Elias a folded telegram. He read it once and his expression changed, not darkened but sharpened. Takota noticed. "More riders coming?" Elias nodded. "From the railroad board." The elder's eyes narrowed. "Friends." Elias looked toward the horizon where a plume of dust rose thin and far. "That depends whether men prefer profit or justice." And as noon heat settled over Red Hollow, while townsfolk began, realizing they had witnessed not punishment but redemption, 5 riders in city suits were already approaching with claims to challenge Boone's deeds, carrying the one thing still capable of testing whether dignity could survive when greed rode back into town. The 5 riders came at noon when heat shimmered above Main Street and even the wind seemed too tired to move. Their horses were tall eastern stock, their saddles too fine for cattle country, and their black coats gathered dust without belonging to it. The lead man dismounted with the confidence of someone accustomed to entering rooms already convinced he would win. Gideon March, counsel for the Continental Rail Board. Even the name sounded polished. He did not remove his gloves. "Mr. Boone," he said, glancing over the survey stakes and seed sacks with faint disdain. "You move quickly for a man presumed dead." Elias stood in front of the saloon doors, sunlight on one shoulder, Dakota beside him. The living often disappoint assumptions. Some townsfolk hid smiles at that. March produced folded claims bearing red seals. He announced the rail board contested the transfer, alleging dormant holdings reverted to corporate trustees decades earlier. Murmurs rose. Hope and fear wrestled again across the faces of those who had just begun believing fortune had turned. Vernon Pike gripped the bar rail until his knuckles paled. The federal recorder accepted the documents, read in silence, then frowned. "Complicated," he admitted. That single word chilled the street more than thunder could have. But Elias did not move. He asked for a table brought into the shade. The men sat there in the dust as if a courtroom had risen out of nowhere. Papers spread. Seals examined. Dates compared. Yet it was not law that shifted the ground. It was memory. Elias opened the blue ledger to a tucked page no one had seen. Inside lay a brittle letter signed by the territorial governor and witnessed by an Apache headman 60 years gone. March read, and color changed in his face. The clause was plain. Any corporate claim failed where tribal covenant attached to the original survey. Dakota gave no smile, but something in his stillness deepened. March tried another angle. Even if lawful, why surrender profitable land? Elias leaned back, old hat shading his eyes. Because profit is a poor god. A few townsfolk removed their hats without knowing why. But March was not finished. He gestured toward the saloon, the hotel, the mercantile. "Do you understand what you could command here?" Elias answered softly enough men leaned in to hear. "I did not come to command. I came to repair." The words settled harder than argument. Then came the quiet duel none forgot. March offered to buy back every deed at triple value, enough money to make kings of lesser men. Dust drifted through the silence. Somewhere a windmill creaked. Elias touched the old silver coin in his palm. "There was a night," he said, "when I was offered life by people who owed me nothing. Since then, I do not sell what was entrusted." Even Gideon March seemed unable to answer that. At last he stood, folded the claims, and gave a short nod almost respectful. "Then the board withdraws." Breath released all along the street. Some laughed from sheer relief. Vernon Pike wiped his eyes pretending sweat caused it. But as the riders prepared to leave, March paused and turned back. "One warning, Boone. Men in distant offices will not like what you have started." Elias looked west where the Apache Ridge shimmered blue. "Then let them dislike it." The riders departed into heat waves, and Red Hollow exhaled as though a storm had passed. Yet before dusk another surprise spread. Elias ordered the town bell rung. Everyone summoned to the square by sundown. Even children came carrying lanterns. For the old rancher who had won without raising his voice was about to reveal who among them would receive land, who would keep businesses, and why one name no one expected had been written beside ownership of the Broken Spur Saloon. By sundown the whole town stood in the square beneath lantern light, their shadows long on the dust, faces gold with fireglow and uncertainty. The old church bell had not rung at dusk in years except for funerals or storms, and some whispered this night felt like both ending and beginning. Elias Boone stood on the mercantile porch. Beside the federal recorder, Dakota at his right, the blue ledger open in his hands. No one spoke when he began. His voice carried plain and slow, the kind men trusted because it did not try to impress. One by one he called names. Widow Harper received title to her pasture. The blacksmith was granted ownership of his forge outright, debt erased. A young family renting a shack by the creek was handed a homestead deed, and the mother covered her mouth as tears caught lantern light. Each name lifted a burden people had worn so long they had mistaken it for skin. Yet all through the readings Vernon Pike stood near the saloon porch, hat in both hands, waiting like a condemned man who expected his sentence at the end. At last Elias closed the ledger. One property remains. Even the horses tied at the rail seemed still. He turned toward the broken spur, the saloon. Vernon swallowed hard. No man breathed. Elias looked at him for a long moment and said, "Come here." The barkeep stepped forward through the crowd. Yesterday he had mocked this man before half the county. Tonight his boots dragged through dust as though shame weighed pounds. Elias held out a folded deed. Vernon stared without touching it. "What is this?" "Your ownership papers." A ripple moved through the crowd. Vernon blinked as if he had misheard. "Mine?" Elias nodded. "On one condition." Silence sharpened. "No thirsty traveler is turned away. Not while those doors stand." Vernon's lips trembled. "After what I did, why give this to me?" Elias answered in a voice low enough many leaned in to catch it. "Because a man changes more when trusted than when ruined." For a heartbeat nobody moved. Then Vernon did something no one in Red Hollow expected. He removed his hat and bowed his head before the old rancher. It was not submission. It was respect. Somewhere near the back a child began clapping, uncertain and honest. Others followed until the square filled with a rough frontier applause unlike anything the town had known. But Elias lifted a hand once more. "There is one more matter." He called Dakota forward and placed the silver coin into the elder's palm before all could see. "This town was bought with law," he said, "but saved by an old debt of kindness." Dakota raised the coin into lantern light. "Then let the people remember," he said. A hush followed that felt almost sacred. Yet in the stillness the federal recorder handed Elias a smaller sealed envelope marked with a forgotten survey number. He opened it, read, and for the first time looked startled. Vernon noticed. "What is it?" Elias looked toward the dark beyond town where cottonwoods stirred. "There is land north of the ridge no one claimed because no one knew it existed." Murmurs rose. More land? More mystery. But Elias only folded the paper. "Tomorrow we ride to see who it belongs to." Lantern flames bent in a new wind. And while Red Hollow believed the reckoning finished, dawn was preparing a final twist none could foresee. For hidden beyond Cottonwood Ridge waited a deserted homestead carrying a name from Elias Boone's past. One that would reveal this was never only about a town, but about a promise made to someone long thought lost. At first light they rode north beyond Cottonwood Ridge, Elias Boone in front, Dakota beside him, Vernon Pike following awkwardly as though still uncertain why he had been invited. A few townsfolk trailed behind on borrowed horses, drawn by the kind of mystery frontier people trust more than sermons. Morning mist clung low over the creek bottoms and the smell of wet sage drifted in the cool air. After 12 miles they reached a rise where an old homestead stood half swallowed by prairie grass. A cabin leaning under age, chimney stones broken, windmill still but somehow watchful. Elias dismounted before the gate and did not move for a long moment. His face had changed. Not hardened, but gone inward. Vernon noticed and whispered, "You knew this place." Elias answered, "Once." They stepped through the warped gate where a rusted child's swing creaked faintly in the breeze. Dust lay thick on the porch except for tracks no one could explain, as if memory itself had been walking there. The survey paper showed the parcel belonged by forgotten inheritance to one surviving claimant. Unnamed. Inside the cabin old sunlight pushed through plank cracks onto a table where something rested beneath cloth. Elias lifted it. A cedar box. His hands trembled. The first tremor anyone had seen in him. Inside lay a woman's brooch of silver and turquoise, a folded letter, and a small deed signed decades ago. He opened the letter slowly. Even Dakota leaned closer. The handwriting was faded but clear. It was from Abigail Boone, Elias's wife, dead these 20 years as everyone believed. Vernon drew breath sharp as a match strike. The letter told a story none in Red Hollow had heard. During a fever winter when Elias vanished on cattle drives, Abigail had sold this northern parcel quietly and hidden the title through a legal trust, fearing greed would one day swallow the valley. She wrote one line Elias read aloud, voice rough with memory. "If men ever mock your poverty, Remind them wealth kept silent can serve justice louder than gold displayed. No one spoke. Even the horses seemed listening. But Dakota pointed to the deed and frowned. One name had been added below Abigail's in newer ink: Elias Boone and Red Hollow Common Trust. The hidden land had been intended not for Elias alone, but as sanctuary land for orphans, widows, and travelers. Vernon removed his hat again. She planned all this? Elias folded the letter as though touching a living hand. She understood me better than I did. Then came the deeper revelation. Beneath the cedar box lay a child's carved horse of mesquite wood. Dakota stared at it and his eyes widened. My grandmother carved these. The same healer who once saved Elias. The threads of debt and kindness had been tied long before any of them knew. Outside on the porch, Elias looked over the valley spread below, Red Hollow tiny in morning haze. This land becomes a refuge, he said. No debts, no evictions, no man forgotten. The townsfolk behind him nodded one by one, some with tears they did not hide. Yet as they prepared to leave, Vernon found a second paper tucked in the box, sealed but never opened. He handed it to Elias. It bore a bank mark from St. Louis dated 2 weeks earlier. Impossible. Abigail, dead 20 years, could not have sent recent correspondence. Elias broke the seal and read in stunned silence. Then he looked toward the horizon where sun lit the prairie gold. There is one more heir, he said quietly. And she is alive. Wind moved through cottonwoods like distant voices. The final promise had not yet finished unfolding. They rode back to Red Hollow beneath a sky washed bright after morning haze, but the town no longer looked the same to those who had gone north. Something unseen had shifted. Even the boardwalk creaks sounded softer, as if the town itself had learned humility. Word spread before they reached Main Street that Elias Boone had found an heir. By dusk, nearly everyone gathered again outside the broken spur, lanterns glowing warm against gathering blue shadows. Elias stood with the unopened letter in his hand, turning its edges between weathered fingers as though still deciding whether destiny ought to be read aloud. Vernon Pike finally asked what all feared to ask. Who is she? Elias looked toward Dakota before answering. A daughter. The word passed through the crowd like wind over tall grass. Many had believed the old rancher a man alone in the world. Even Vernon stepped back in shock. Elias unfolded the St. Louis letter and read. Years before, when fever and drought had broken families apart, Abigail had sent their infant daughter east with relatives after believing frontier hardship would bury her. The child, Clara Boone, had grown into a schoolteacher in Missouri and had written after tracing an inheritance line newly uncovered by the bank. She was already on her way west. Murmurs turned to wonder. A daughter alive. A future no one imagined. Yet Elias seemed less triumphant than quiet, as if joy carried its own ache. 3 days later, just before sundown, a stagecoach rolled into Red Hollow trailing red dust. Every soul in town seemed waiting. The coach door opened and a woman stepped down in a traveling coat the color of storm clouds, carrying a worn valise and looking around with eyes strangely familiar. Gray-blue like Elias. Time itself appeared to hesitate. Elias did not move at first. Neither did she. Then Clara smiled uncertainly and said, "Father." No grand speeches followed. He crossed the street slow as if afraid she might vanish and simply took her hands. Many watching would later say no gunfight or cattle drive ever held such tension as that silence. Dakota inclined his head as though greeting an old prophecy fulfilled. Clara listened through the evening as Elias told of the hidden deeds, the restored lands, the refuge planned at the northern homestead. Then she did something none expected. She opened her valise and withdrew school ledgers, primers, slates. The refuge needs a school, she said. And Red Hollow has children. Even Gideon March, who had returned out of curiosity, smiled at that. Within days, carpenters began converting the old church annex into a schoolhouse. The saloon served free coffee beside free water. Travelers arriving from 3 counties away spoke of a town where insult had become generosity. Yet one last quiet reversal remained. Vernon Pike approached Elias at dusk outside the saloon and held out the old silver coin. "This belongs with you." Elias closed Vernon's fingers over it again. "No," he said. "Keep it where thirsty men can see it." The coin was mounted beside the bar beneath a simple line burned into oak. No one turned away. But later that night Clara found her father staring west at the dark ridge. "You should be at peace," she whispered. Elias answered, "Almost." He handed her Abigail's first letter. Folded inside was a map none had noticed, marked beyond the northern refuge at a spring called Mercy Bend. Beside it Abigail had written 6 words. "The promise ends where the spring begins." Clara looked up, puzzled. Dakota, standing in moonlight outside, spoke without entering. "Then tomorrow," he said, "we ride once more." And everyone in Red Hollow slept believing the story complete, while beyond Mercy Bend a final truth waited that would show the old rancher had not bought a town to own it, but to leave it behind. At dawn they rode to Mercy Bend, only 4 of them, Elias Boone, Clara, Dakota, and Vernon Pike, as if the land itself had asked for quiet witnesses. No townsfolk followed. Some endings belonged to stillness. The trail narrowed through cottonwoods silver in morning light, then opened upon a spring clear as glass pouring from stone, into a shallow basin ringed with wild grass. Nothing grand stood there, no treasure, no hidden town, only water moving over rock with the patient sound of time forgiving men. Elias dismounted first and walked to the spring as though returning to a church built before words. Beside the water stood a weathered marker half sunk in earth. Dakota brushed away moss and old dust. Carved into the stone were names nearly erased by seasons. Abigail Boone, Sonia of the River Clan, Clara Boone. Vernon stared in silence. Elias touched the names with trembling fingers. "Sonia," he said softly, "the healer who saved me, and Abigail knew her." Dakota nodded. "They made a covenant here." Clara unfolded Abigail's map again and found writing hidden faint between fold lines. Ink nearly vanished. Elias read aloud, voice slowed by wonder. "When pride wounds a man, let him answer not with possession, but with shelter. Let the spring remain open to all who thirst, for that was always the wealth." For a long while no one spoke. Wind moved through reeds. A hawk circled high over the bend. Then Clara noticed stones arranged beside the spring in a rough foundation line. Old, deliberate. Dakota smiled almost imperceptibly. "The refuge begins here." In that moment the final twist came not as shock, but recognition. Elias had never truly bought a town for revenge. Abigail and the healer had set this path decades before. The insult in the saloon had only awakened a promise sleeping in paper and memory. Red Hollow had not been conquered. It had been invited into an old covenant. Vernon sank to one knee at the water and drank from cupped hands, then laughed softly through tears. "Yesterday I would have charged for this." Even Elias smiled. They spent the day marking ground for a traveler's rest beside the spring, a place for strangers, widows, drifters, and any soul needing water and welcome. By sunset they rode back slower than they came. Gold light lay over the valley, and Red Hollow below looked less like a frontier town than a small hope held in dust. Weeks passed. The schoolhouse opened under Clara's hand. The northern refuge took in families no one else would have noticed. The saloon door bore the silver coin mounted in oak, and travelers rode miles to see the place where an old rancher answered insult with generosity. But one morning Elias was gone. No farewell. Only his horse missing from the rail and a folded deed left on Clara's desk transferring every remaining claim to the Red Hollow Common Trust. At the bottom he had written, in the same steady hand that signed the old surveys, "A town is worth owning only if no one owns it alone." They found him at Mercy Bend near dusk, seated beside the spring, hat on his knee, watching water move over stone as though listening to old companions. He was alive, only resting, and when Clara sat beside him he said, "I spent half my life thinking justice arrived like thunder. Turns out it sounds more like water." Years later, people would tell of Elias Boone as the man refused a drink who bought a town. But those who knew would correct them. He did not buy the town. He gave it back. And in Red Hollow, when strangers asked why free water waited on every counter, Vernon Pike would point to the silver coin and say, "Out here, dignity costs less than whiskey." Then he would fall quiet, because the old rancher taught them the deepest Western truth of all. Some men fire shots to make history hear them. Others leave a spring open in the desert and let mercy do the talking.